Afternoon. Welcome to the Mitigation Working Group of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. I'm Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. Note that we're recording this meeting for note-taking purposes. Great seeing so many people joining us today. I think we have one or two people standing in for members, so if you're standing in for one of the MWG members, if you would take a minute to introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Mark. In that case, I'm Mari Rosales from the Metric Conservancy, standing in for Michelle Dietz.
Great, thanks for joining.
Hi, Mark. Sean Kiernan. I'm standing in for Sandy Hertz today.
Hey, Sean.
From
Thanks.
MDOT.
Anyone else?
Hello, everyone. My name is Malika Holmes. I'm standing in for Nicola Tran.
Oh, great. Hey, Malika. Thanks for joining us today. And
Good
thanks.
afternoon, Mark. I'm with the Maryland Clean Energy Center for Kathy Magruder.
Oh, great. Thanks, Pamela. And to all the members of the public, thanks for calling in today. We'll be sure to leave time later in today's meeting to hear public comments and give everyone the opportunity to contribute to today's discussion. Let me turn things over to Kim Goebel and Mike Powell, the co-chairs, for any opening remarks.
I'll start, Kim, if you want to. We really got two subjects we want to focus on today. The steering committee has suggested, first of all, continued focus on fundraising. What are the alternatives? One of the things the steering committee had suggested is that we should look at what other states are doing, that might be the best way to look at what the options are, the pros and cons. Secondly, we've had problems in prior years where people came in with often very good suggestions very late in the year, and it was too late for us to devote any time to them. So we're trying to set aside, assuming time allows, some opportunity for people to broach new subjects with the assumption that we're not going to resolve those subjects here, but at least we can help us decide what we want to look at and provide some time for at least some of, if not all, perhaps all, of the suggestions that members of the working group would have. So I think that's where we're going. Kim?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I want to also welcome the folks from Washington State. As a person that graduated from the University of Washington, welcome. Really happy you're here and very excited about the presentation. I think this is going to be a key conversation for us. So I hope everybody's taking good notes today because we're going to get some good information.
And as a person who applied to but was rejected from UW, I'll also extend my welcome. And I'm only slightly bitter about that to this day. Yes, no, I'm really excited to have our guests from Washington. We'll take some time later in today's meeting to introduce them, but I want to hit a few things before we get there. So first, a quick update from MDE. As I shared last time, the federal government's been rolling out some really exciting announcements. I want to share another couple with you. The EPA finalized its rules for existing coal-fired power plants and new gas-fired power plants. The rules will accelerate the nation's transition from dirty to clean energy sources while delivering billions of dollars in public health benefits to Americans. The EPA is currently accepting comments to inform its rulemaking for existing gas-fired power plants. That forthcoming rule, more so than the finalized rules, could impact energy generation in Maryland. Also, the DOE, Department of Energy, finalized new water heater standards, which essentially require new storage water heaters to operate with heat pumps and not electric resistance heating starting in 2029. The rule also sets higher efficiency standards for gas water heaters. And while I'm on the topic, just a quick public service announcement. If your water heater is at least 10 years old, then note that some of Maryland's electric utility companies are currently offering a $1,600 rebate to help you buy a new heat pump water heater. And that could be stacked with a 30% tax credit. Heat pump water heaters save a whopping $550 per year on average compared to the cost of running an electric resistance water heater. So for many consumers, any additional upfront cost for the heat pump water heater is paid back within just a few years. And one more PSA, just because PSAs are fun. Funding for the state's $3,000 EV tax credit will be renewed on July 1st. That means EVs purchased in Maryland after July 1 may be eligible for the $3,000 state incentive and up to $7,500 from the federal government, for a total of $10,500 off your potential new EV in the new year, the new fiscal year at least. Of course, driving an EV also saves the average driver around $1,000 annually in avoided gas costs. And I'll note that instant acceleration is wicked fun. So on to the main business of today. During our last meeting, several of you expressed an interest in having the MWG examine climate funding mechanisms so that the Climate Commission could better advise the Governor and General Assembly on the approach Maryland should take to achieve its GHG reduction requirements. As you'll recall, Maryland's Climate Pollution Reduction Plan calls for additional investments to help everyone transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. Based largely on the Climate Commission's recommendations, the plan calls for investments to help even more people buy EVs, install EV charging stations, install heat pumps, and perform other energy-saving measures in residential and commercial buildings, support industrial decarbonization projects, support workforce development, and much more. Today, we'll look at the funding mechanisms used by Maryland and several other climate-leading states to drive clean energy investments. But first, I want to quickly address one question that was also raised during the last meeting. A member asked how federal funding opportunities can and cannot cover some of the investments that are called for in the climate plan, and I want to provide kind of a high-level answer to that question. The climate plan already includes formula funding and tax credits in its current policy scenario. So if you will, that means that it's really only the competitive federal funding that would be considered additional funding to support the new initiatives that were called for in the climate plan. And when we look at the competitive funding opportunities, we see great potential to receive grants for some types of climate plan investments. For example, MDE recently applied for $145 million from the EPA to help buildings meet the proposed building energy performance standards. We also applied for funding to build out the charging network for electrified medium and heavy duty vehicles, right? So these are some of the examples where if we receive these awards, that would count as new federal funding that could cover some of the investments called for in the plan. However, very importantly, the plan calls for a sustained investment of approximately $1 billion a year. When we examine all of the federal funding opportunities, we see that they aren't likely to add up to the total investment that's needed. The federal funding is also one-time funding, so not the sustained funding that's needed to transform Maryland to a net zero emissions economy over the next 20 years. This is why the climate plan calls on the state to develop a new funding mechanism to provide sustained investment. And that's also a good segue into today's main show, examining the climate funding mechanisms used by other climate-leading states. So I have some slides to set us up for this before we turn things over to our colleagues from Washington, but let me pull up my slides first. So my team, and huge kudos to one of our new policy analysts, Jared Williams on my team, for helping with some of these slides. So our team examined the budgets of 9 climate-leading states to determine the primary mechanisms used to fund GHG emission reduction initiatives. The states included in our analysis were California, Colorado, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, Maine, New Jersey, New York, and Washington. The finding at a very high level is that cap and invest and ratepayer funded programs are the most common mechanisms used by states for generating significant revenue for climate investments. So this table shows kind of a high level overview of some of the common funding mechanisms used by states. So starting at the top and starting on the top left side, we have general funds. Of course, just about every state that we examined puts some of its general funds into climate initiatives. We also saw that all of the states are utilizing the settlement from the Volkswagen diesel emissions scandal for climate investments. Every state that we analyzed has a green bank. Now, some of those green banks are leveraged in much different ways and able to offer much more or less capital. But in general, we see green banks are a common mechanism used to provide support for climate investments. And then ratepayer funds like Maryland's Empower program are also very common instruments used across the states that we analyzed. And often those ratepayer funded programs wind up generating pretty substantial revenue. In the case of Massachusetts, I think that it was somewhere in the ballpark of about $600 million a year through the Mass Save program. Then we have cap and invest programs. So cap and invest is used in every state that we analyzed, or every state that we analyzed is considering cap and invest, at least for power plants. So as I'll talk more about in a minute, we've had a cap and invest program for Maryland's power plants for a long time now. And we see that some states have expanded that cap and invest model to cover sources beyond just power plants. We call that generally economy-wide cap and invest programs. So in that category, we've got California and Washington with active programs. New York has committed to developing an economy-wide program, and according to at least one source, Colorado is considering this program as well. And then finally, in this snapshot, we also look at fossil fuel lawsuits. So, and this is just looking at state level lawsuits. We have some states that are suing the fossil fuel industry for damages done and trying to collect payments. It's a little too early to say what those payments might look like and when they might come, but just noting that we do have several states pursuing that as a general funding mechanism for climate investments. We also analyzed how this breaks out in terms of kind of per capita spending from the state funded and ratepayer funded programs. And this is, in this case, we're honing in, trying to do an apples to apples comparison. So we looked at just two types of common investments that states are making. EV incentives, these are the incentives that help consumers in their states purchase electric vehicles, and more broadly, home decarbonization, which could be, heat pump incentives, weatherization incentives, so on and so forth. So by looking at just those budgets, we see this range of per capita spending across the states. And the states with the highest per capita spending on these specific climate investments are California and Massachusetts. California has a long and successful cap and trade or cap and invest program. Massachusetts has actually two different cap and invest programs for their power plants. They participate in RGGI, and then they have a separate cap and invest program to further drive emission reductions for power plants in Massachusetts. So they've got kind of those two cap and invests, and the Mass Save program, which is kind of like our Empower program, generates significant revenue at about $600 million a year. Washington State, as we'll hear in a few minutes from our guests, also has an economy-wide cap and invest program providing pretty substantial per capita spending, and so on and so forth, right? So you can get a kind of snapshot on the level of investment, at least on a per capita basis here. So what is cap and invest at a high level? It's a requirement, it's a regulation for covered sources. So it requires CO2 sources like power plants to turn in allowances for their emissions. There is a declining cap or a limit on the number of allowances that are allowed, or therefore the amount of emissions allowed from those CO2 sources. There's trading between the sources. So if one source has driven their emissions lower below that cap, they then have credits that they're able to trade to an entity that is perhaps above their cap. It requires that those allowances are sold at an auction so that it's the marketplace and not the government setting the actual price on carbon. And then it allows the state to invest the auction proceeds into whatever the state's goals are, right? It could be further decreasing emissions, improving public health, reducing energy costs. The investment of the proceeds is really up to the state. And in the case of Maryland, the General Assembly has been very prescriptive in how the investments made through the RGGI program are made. And just in case you're more of a visual person, someone a few years ago from NRDC made this illustration, which also just kind of simplifies what I just said, right? The government sets a declining limit on the carbon pollution from power plants. Price of carbon is established. And then with the sale of the allowances, the proceeds from the sale of the allowances, the government is able to make additional investments in its community. So our existing Cap and Invest program is our participation under RGGI. For 17 years now, this has been humming along in Maryland, reducing power plant emissions. Power plant emissions have decreased more than 63% since the start of the program. Maryland has invested more than $1 billion in the allocation of auction proceeds and energy projects. Recently, the annual revenue has been around $150 million a year. The majority of the proceeds are invested in low-income households and facilities serving low and moderate income communities. And regionally, more than $16 billion in energy bill savings have been accrued in the RGGI states. Also looking regionally, we see a net economic benefit of about $4 billion, 4,000 additional jobs, and carbon emissions reduced from power plants by about 50% across the RGGI states. And Maryland Matters reported in 2022, by almost any measure, RGGI is one of the most successful programs in the world to fight climate change. So we're very proud of our participation in RGGI and Maryland's historic and current leadership among the RGGI states. You might also recall that in our climate plan, we floated the idea of new funding sources that for the state to consider as we march toward our ambitious 2031 goal. That included on that laundry list, of course, expanding the RGGI model to other sectors through an economy-wide Cap and Invest program, among other measures that the MWG could discuss further in additional meetings this year. With those new investments, the climate plan proposes putting that money into Maryland communities in a number of ways. Investing in home energy efficiency and electrification, making significant investments in commercial, multifamily, and institutional buildings, building out, helping people get into electric vehicles, and providing additional charging infrastructure, supporting industrial decarbonization projects, public infrastructure projects, nature-based solutions, investing in workforce development and consumer education, and helping MEA build up the Maryland Clean Buildings Hub to provide technical assistance for many of these projects. So the status of economy-wide Cap and Invest in the United States is summarized in this map. All of the new Northeast states and several Mid-Atlantic states are participating in the Cap and Invest program for power plants, known as RGGI. We also, in our region, have New York committing to expanding into an economy-wide Cap and Invest program. And on the West Coast, we've got Washington and California with active Cap and Invest programs, and several other states that are considering. And at this point, I've said enough. I want to turn things over to the real pros. So we're grateful to be joined by some folks from Washington State, including Becky Kelly, Senior Policy Advisor for Climate in the office of Governor Jay Inslee, and Andy Hayes, the Cap and Invest Policy Section Manager in the Washington State Department of Ecology. And Becky, I guess, how about I turn it to you and I can pull up your slides for you.
Thanks, Mark. Uh-oh, I'm echoing. Hopefully that's fixable. There we go. Well, good morning. Really pleased to be with you all. Thanks for the invitation to join and for me and Andy to share information about what's happening in Washington, what we've learned, what's hard, some reflections. I think mostly we're going to do an overview presentation about both the program and the investments, and then definitely want to open it up to questions. I'm sure you will have a lot. And I know you are all want to say thank you at the outset, because I know you are all folks who are spending your time on addressing climate change, and the state of Maryland will be better for your efforts. So thank you for all you do. Thank you. Next slide. So just a couple slides of context for you about Washington State and our emissions profile and our policy landscape. So as you're thinking about kind of comparing our situation and yours, you have a little bit of context. Think about how similar and how different our states might be. So this is a little bit outdated data, but gives you the basic picture of where our emissions come from in Washington State. So we are transportation heavy in terms of our emissions because our power is relatively clean. We have a lot of hydropower and increasing amounts of clean electricity and renewable electricity. So transportation is our biggest contributor, and then residential and commercial. This particular slide shows you, it doesn't show electricity as a sector, it shows electricity allocated to where it's used. So you can see transportation and buildings, residential and commercial, are our biggest sectors, and then industrial, a little bit from agriculture and waste management. So that's the problem that we're working to solve here in Washington. And next slide. So we have a statutory legally binding commitment to reach net zero by 2050. That's in state law, with a 95% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from our 1990 levels by 2050. So there's a little bit of accommodation there for some carbon drawdown to make up for what may be some very hard to decarbonize things at the end. But we are trying to decarbonize our entire economy. And we have a suite of policies that have been passed. You can see the years that you see here are when the policies go into effect. You can see these are pretty recent years. We have been working on climate policy in Washington for a long time. I came to the governor's office after a long stint in the nonprofit environmental and climate advocacy world. And we first passed our limits on GHG emissions in 2008. And we have had a long series of conversations with the public, at the ballot, with legislators. And then we've kind of gotten to a place in recent years where we've been able to the legislature's enacted a number of powerful policies. We have 100% clean energy law, hydrofluorocarbon reduction laws, this centerpiece that we're talking about today, our Cap and Invest program. We have a clean fuel standard, building codes, clean cars standards, and building performance standards. So they all work together in a complementary fashion to help us achieve these blue boxes are statutorily required reductions that you see. And a friend of mine who's been active in this space for decades has a phrase that I like, which is that the Cap and Invest, or the economy-wide program, sort of bats cleanup, which is a little undervaluing its role maybe, but it is all these sector-specific policies help drive changes in particular parts of the economy. But the Cap and Invest program, by putting a price on pollution and investing a lot of money in the solutions, particularly equitably, is really the kind of foundation of the whole enterprise. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andy. He's going to talk about the basic design and components of our program. And then I'm going to come back in and talk to you about how we're spending the revenues to reduce emissions and increase equity and deal with climate impacts.
Great. Thank you, Becky. Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning from Washington. Good afternoon to those of you in Maryland, which is almost all of you, as a matter of fact, it seems. So I'm the Cap and Invest Policy Section Manager. So I work in the Department of Ecology, which is the agency that's charged with implementing the Climate Commitment Act, and actually some of these other policies that you saw on this slide. I'll say my team does a broad in the policy group, which is one of 3 groups that implement the Cap and Invest program, does a pretty wide range of uh, work related to statutory and rule analysis, rulemaking, legislative initiatives, dealing with emergent issues in the world of sort of decarbonization and climate. We work with covered entities who are participating in the program, and also interest groups to address program issues, concerns, and emerging issues. We also coordinate with other agencies, states, and the federal government, and we work on environmental justice concerns and analyze environmental justice impacts. So we do a pretty wide variety of, for context, we do a pretty wide variety of work. And I'll say, I just, on a personal note, this is some of the work I find the most rewarding, coming and talking to you all on this. You know, we're all committed to doing this important work, and we're really pleased to be here, and we're really excited to share what we've been doing in Washington. Next slide, please. Okay, so broadly speaking, there are 3 main goals of the Climate Commitment Act, which is the law in Washington that brought about our Cap and Invest program. The first is that it reduces climate pollution. It really seeks to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted into the environment by implementing this market-based system to achieve those reductions at the lowest cost to the economy and therefore to the people of Washington. It reduces air pollution, which, you know, by reducing also criteria air pollutants, which are released predominantly through the combustion of fossil fuels. We know that the impacts of these pollutants fall disproportionately to overburdened communities and vulnerable populations, and so this is a key outcome of the law. And lastly, it prioritizes environmental justice by focusing revenues to directly benefit those vulnerable populations in overburdened communities. It does so by requiring that 35 to and ideally 40% of auction revenues go directly to benefit these communities, and 10% of the revenue goes to projects with tribal support and ideally with tribal benefits as well. Next slide, please. So how does the Cap and Invest program work? It sets a cap on pollution, which reduces year over year, requiring reductions in emissions by limiting the amount of emissions allowed. This has the effect of incentivizing investment in decarbonization on the part of companies and those who emit greenhouse gases. Our program covers about 70 to 75% of our economy, and it requires those entities that generate more than 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent to purchase emissions allowances, or in some instances are provided those allowances at no cost. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. Revenue raised by the sales of these allowances at state-held auctions is invested into decarbonize the economy, build climate resilience, and advance environmental justice. I should say also, notably, that Washington's program is really designed in large part. You know, we took the legislature and sort of the creators of the CCA took big pieces. You know, we were standing on broad shoulders in the development of the CCA. So we took a lot predominantly from California's program, but also from other cap and trade programs. And so our program was built to be sort of the next evolution of that work. And it was also designed to link ease our market easily with California and Quebec, or the so-called WCI market, which Washington is working right now towards becoming a part of, and thereby creating a larger carbon market. Next slide, please. So we mentioned what's covered in our economy. So about 70 to 75% of the economy is covered. So what specifically is covered? Well, as I mentioned, facilities that emit more than 25 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year are covered, as is gasoline and on-road diesel, electricity and natural gas. And we have sort of in the future, waste energy and railroads are set to be covered in the not so distant future. What isn't covered, notably smaller facilities, so those that are less than 25,000 metric tons below that threshold, agriculture, and both aviation fuels and most marine fuels in Washington. Next slide, please. So as you could see some of this in the previous chart that Becky showed at the beginning, at the top of the deck. We have established targets in Washington to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those targets are a 45% reduction from 1990 levels by 2030, 70% by 2040, and 95% by 2050. What that means for those three, in terms of our implementation of the Cap and Invest program, for those three periods, that means our cap, which is set to track with the reductions, the state defined reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. It means a 7% decline between 2023, when the program started, and 2030. Then means a 1.8% decline between 2030 and 2040, and then a 2.6% annual decline between 2040 and 2050. And so you can sort of see the slope of those lines changes over time as we are looking to decarbonize our economy in the next 25 odd years. I'll say that we enforce our program compliance annually and in 4-year compliance instruments. You can see these sort of striping here in there. So there are covered entities have to provide part of their allowance to cover their emissions every year, and then the balance every 4 years gets trued up, if you will. I'll say significantly to this chart, one thing that you all may notice, the 7% annual rate of decline is very ambitious between now and 2030. It's quite steep, and it exceeds what has been established in other jurisdictions. We are undertaking this steep decline because the need for immediate climate action in the face of accelerating impacts from climate change. We are, as I said, the markets that we have learned from the most probably are California and Quebec. They have had less steep declines. They have slightly different reductions, but perhaps more importantly, they've been doing this for 10 years. And so we're a little bit later to the game. And so that means we've got, in order to meet our goals, we have to do that in a shorter time period, certainly on the initial end. Really, I think our take home from this is, we believe what matters most is what we're able to achieve in the near term. It's critically important that we start this process of moving our economy and reducing our emissions. And that's how we've established these aggressive targets. Next slide, please. A unique and critical component of the Climate Commitment Act is its emphasis on improving air quality in overburdened communities. So it calls for improvements in air quality in these communities. The first step is to understand the problem, and it does so by expanding air quality monitoring in overburdened communities. To that end, Ecology has, the Department of Ecology, my agency, has identified 16 highly impacted communities and is improving air quality monitoring in those communities to help inform needed actions. We plan to firstly make investments in communities to address air quality and build community capacity in these communities. And we also have planned to undertake rulemaking to improve air quality requirements in the coming years. Further, the Department of Ecology will be tracking and reporting to the public on air pollution and health data every 2 years so that we can assess progress and take additional steps and investments as necessary. Next slide, please. And this gives you a sense, this is the state of Washington. This gives you a sense of where these 16 highly impacted communities are. I should say that these are not the only communities in Washington that are impacted by air pollution, and therefore we hope to benefit from the Climate Commitment Act. But these are the ones that we identified as the most highly impacted. You can see both their location, and you can see the shading on this chart, that these are areas with high levels of criteria air pollutants, both on the east and the west side of Washington. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Becky to speak about the investments we're making from the revenue proceeds from the Cap and Invest program.
Thanks, Andy. Next slide, please. So the Climate Commitment Act, a lot of letters on the screen. There could have been even more, but to give you a sense, the statute laid out in broad terms, it created several accounts. It laid out how the money should be spent at a high level. So the initial law that passed, and then the legislature appropriates the revenue in much more specific ways in their biennial budget process. So there's a carbon emission reduction account that is really focused on cleaning up transportation emissions, because as you saw in that pie chart, that's our biggest source of pollution. The climate investment account actually has two sub accounts. One is focused on 75% of that middle account goes to a variety of decarbonization activities, and there's a very long eligible list. There's 25% of the funding in that account goes to natural climate solutions, which I saw on one of Mark's slides earlier, which is really a combination of, we're the evergreen state, we're about half forested, we have kind of rich natural resources and an ocean coastline and so forth. So it's a combination of dealing with climate resilience, because we're feeling the impacts like all states are, and also looking at natural climate solutions that can store carbon and contribute to drawing down emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So forestry solutions, agriculture solutions, et cetera. And then this special bucket, the difficult to pronounce acronym AQUADIA, is focused specifically on air quality and health disparities improvement. So that as the legislature was debating the law, they wanted to make sure there's a big cross-cutting commitment to equity, that 35 to 40%, 10% for tribally supported projects, but they also wanted to set aside a bucket of money for really honing in on overburdened communities and air quality and health issues. So I'm going to walk through some slides. You can do the next slide. Oops. So this program in the first 2 years has / is projected to raise a very large sum of money, $3.251 billion. The legislature enacted $2.1 billion in their biennial budget for 23 to 25, and then they just concluded. We meet every year. There's a long budget year and a short session for the non-budget years. They do a budget tune-up, and so our supplemental budget added another $1.1 billion in expected revenues. So some of that has already come in the auctions we've conducted, and additionally, additional revenues are forecast for this biennium because we've got quarterly auctions happening. This chart just gives you a sense of some of the different categories. So environmental justice per se, very specific targeted investments, agriculture, sequestration, methane, we've got buildings, we've got clean energy, transportation, resilience, federal funding support. I want to highlight this, and we can talk about it more in Q&A if it's of interest. One of the really powerful things about having this fund source right now is it is a source of funding that we can use to leverage Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act money. So one small example, we were competing for a hydrogen hub from the US DOE. We put $20 million, and the legislature put $20 million of CCA funds, that's our acronym for this program, CCA, sorry, I slipped into that, into our application for a hub. And that has turned into a $1 billion grant from US DOE for the Northwest Green Hydrogen Hub. So it's an incredibly helpful time to have a state pot of money that we can use to access more federal funding and be more successful in gaining that. Next slide. I'm not going to read these slides because we'd be here too long and wouldn't have enough time for questions, so I'm going to kind of zip through the next few slides, and also was partly designing these so that you would have access to them afterwards if you want to look at details. But we've talked a lot about the way that equity is baked into the law, both in the provisions for clean air and in the provisions for how the money is spent. So you heard we have a 35% must spend at least 35% in overburdened communities, and with a goal of 40 doing the math on our biennial numbers, we're actually at 43% investment in overburdened communities and 7.3% for tribes, tribally supported projects. We actually think when you count all of the projects that tribes support, we will exceed the 10% required. Next slide, please. So these are the slides I said I would kind of zip through a little bit, but just to give you a sense, one of the things that is powerful about this law is that the legislature has had sufficient revenue to make deep investments in a lot of different areas. And as you all know well, decarbonizing your entire economy it's a really diffuse task. There are so many things that need to be done. So we have ferries in Washington. We're decarbonizing those. We have a major investment in transit, active transportation. So that's the biking, rolling, walking, safe routes to school, etc. EV charging, EV infrastructure, drayage trucks. Our governor is going to visit the Port of Seattle tomorrow. We are working to electrify our drayage trucks at our ports. We have very low-income and overburdened communities that are around our ports, and cleaning up the ports is a significant benefit of this program. And then rail electrification, shore power. Next slide. And then buildings is our second largest source and our fastest growing source of pollution. So electrifying homes and businesses, especially for low-income households, actually cleaning up our own act in terms of state higher education campuses. There's a lot of work to do there. Same for state facilities. We're doing energy retrofits, solar power on our public buildings, audits. These are just kind of highlights. Next slide. I mentioned environmental justice. It is cross-cutting. You know, you think about many of those investments on the transportation page are actually benefiting overburdened communities, but then we want to, you know, we highlight some specific things that the budget does. This, in the supplemental budget, the legislature decided to provide $200 energy vouchers for low and moderate income electric customers. And we talked about the air quality improvement in overburdened communities, and low-income solar is another. Next slide. So resilience, I'm sure Maryland is really grappling with this, as all states are right now. We have this tremendous need to decarbonize, but we also are feeling the impacts now, and it's hurting communities and people and ecosystems across the state. So using funding to protect streamside areas, to help our tribes deal with climate impacts. We have coastal tribes that are actually having to relocate some of their tribal facilities because of sea level rise. We have salmon is a big focus in Washington State, recovering our salmon, and so we have a lot of efforts to build salmon habitat, improve fish passage. We're slowly but surely enacting legislation to take account of climate, to take account of land use and how our growth management and our, you know, urban planning and sprawl and so forth contributes to climate change. And so we've got grants to local government to help them address some new laws in that space. And next slide, please. Agriculture, we have a very significant agriculture economy in Washington. It's a major land use. So we've got, and forestry, as I mentioned, we've got a variety of natural climate solutions for farms, for our state trust lands. We have a couple million acres of state forests, landfills. So we're beginning to deal with the really potent pollution, methane pollution that comes from our landfills, and just dealing with fire risk, which is huge in our area, and spending money on making communities less vulnerable to wildfire. Next slide. All right, so that was the speedy flyover of the investments. I can also follow up, Mark, with a link. We have a pretty great summary on our one of our state websites that is pretty accessible. It's just a great list. And I think I have been seeing lots of questions pop up in the chat, but I've been trying to not track them while I was talking. So Mark, I assume you'll help facilitate us through questions.
Yeah, can do. And I'm going to take a facilitator privilege here and asking the first question, which is, your program has encountered some of the same criticism that occurs, I think, every time a program like this is launched. You know, California, states that have adopted RGGI have all encountered the same sort of you know, pushback on what, you know, what this means for energy costs and so on and so forth. I just wonder if you can react to what is, of course, the most common, you know, line of concern that people have about these programs.
Yes, I'll start and Andy should hop in as well. So we are having major pushback. We actually have a ballot measure on the statewide ballot this fall to repeal this law. Don't want to hide that fact. that is something that is happening in Washington State. I cannot speak to or opine on that as a state employee, but it's up for vote this fall. There's a larger sort of political scenario going on there. There are a whole bunch of major state policies across a range of issues that have been put on the ballot by a group of folks this fall. So it's not just climate. That's under the gun. So there has been pushback about prices. I will say the path to adopting this law in Washington State was a long one. We actually had a couple of different climate ballot measures over the years, neither of which passed, but that were brought forward by the public, different segments of the public. And I would say that the political desire to deal with this problem has been growing in our state amongst the people and the business community and the legislature. And folks landed on Cap and Invest as the most efficient and effective and cost-effective way of reducing emissions, and the one that could bring the most benefit to communities through the investments. And so the conversation we're having in Washington State right now is about the necessity of action on climate change, the cost of inaction, the ways that it's harming us and our families and our beloved state, and the fact that the investments are going to make a difference in people's lives and give more people affordable access to the clean energy solutions and transportation solutions that they desire. But that's an active conversation. And I know from conversations across states, we're part of the U.S. Climate Alliance with many of the states that you've been talking about, Mark, and how you balance the urgency of action and making it equitable and cost effective for consumers is an important design question. And I think keeping front and centered the increasing personal and sort of public price of climate change. It's part of our responsibility as citizens and as folks working in government to make sure that we're really talking about that reality. Andy, would you add anything? Or maybe you want to keep chugging through questions, Mark.
Quick question for you both. Do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour?
I could run over at least a bit. I can be late to my next.
Okay, so we'll plan on taking at least then 10 minutes. I see several for now. Hands up from MWG members, so I'll handle this in the order that they came in. Bob Wright, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have two questions. One is for sources that are greater than 25,000 metric tons. They have to buy allowances, but is it the allowances for the emissions over that, or do they have to pay allowances for everything? That's the first question. Okay, I'll ask the second question then. You're producing hydrogen, the green hydrogen, which I assume then you're using electricity. And my question is, what do you see the use of the hydrogen? Because if you had that electricity, you might say, well, I would, help get it into EVs or whatnot. So what are the trade-offs from using the electricity to reduce your emissions versus you're producing hydrogen, and who's going to buy it and for what purpose?
Andy, do you want to take the first one and I'll take the second one?
Yeah, so they're responsible for all their emissions, including those sort of above and below 25,000 metric tons. And so, you know, larger, there is that threshold will dictate whether a company is responsible for, or an emitter of any type is responsible for those, getting allowances for those emissions.
Thank you for that one.
Sorry, too many screens open. Thank you, Robert. That's a fantastic question about hydrogen. We're grappling with that. So we have, like most of the country, we have very rapidly growing needs for green electricity and projected to continue going up as we electrify everything that we can. So our hydrogen effort is very focused. It's in partnership with Oregon Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub. It's very focused on hard to decarbonize sectors and sort of the best and highest use, where green hydrogen is a solution for uses that are not easily electrified and not projected to be easily electrified in, you know, the next 10, 15, 20 years. So things like industrial decarbonization, replacing blue hydrogen with green hydrogen at refineries, which it's some major refineries use a lot of hydrogen, but it's fossil fuel based now. Heavy duty transport, maritime, peak hour needs for trying, you know, being able to use a hydrogen fuel cell that can generate power when there's a lot of renewable energy available, and store it, and then use that instead of a natural gas fired solution as like a peak solution. So great question. And we are really committed to not spending green electrons to make hydrogen for something that we could have just directly electrified, because that's not a good climate choice.
Thanks.
And
Going to,
I'm a little bit less tight on the back end, so I can be flexible.
okay, thank you. Mike Powell.
Yeah, just one comment, by the way. As steep as your curve would be, ours would be steeper because we'd be starting later, and our target's 60% by 2031. But the question I've got is, an issue that's often been raised here is the question of leakage, because we've got two much bigger states that are, you know, no more than 20 or 30 minutes away from our metropolitan areas. So what are you doing to try to avoid leakage, or is it a problem with your program?
Andy, do you want to speak to the EITE piece in particular?
Yeah, the biggest, obviously, there are lots of forms of leakage, and we're thinking about all of those. But the one I think maybe is most relevant to your question is sort of large industry. So the way that our program addresses that is for so we have a partial solution to that, and we're working on a permanent solution to that. In the near term, when the law was passed, it essentially provides what we call no-cost allowances to large industry in the near term. So they receive their allowances based on a calculation, their energy use, et cetera. They receive most of their allowances, if not all, in many cases, in the next number of years at no cost to them. In basically, this is an ongoing conversation. We're going to be coming back to our legislature in the coming 2 years to discuss a longer term trajectory for large industry that will have those their emissions come under our cap just like every other emitter. And so the short-term solution to address this was to provide these so-called no-cost allowances to facilities. The longer-term solution will mean probably a more nuanced set of incentives for companies to reduce emissions at the lowest cost to them, and hopefully a dynamic kind of regulatory structure that that allows them to continue to make choices about how they decarbonize in a way that still brings industry down to below the cap, between now and 2050. I will say that there's industries are, as you all probably know, not all industry is created equal in this regard. Some industries are much easier to decarbonize than others. And so we expect that sort of pathway may look different for different industries. And therefore some may decarbonize quite a bit sooner if there are easy ways, for instance, for them to electrify, right? That's low-hanging fruit. But the others will be more complicated and take a longer period of time. So we expect to see decarbonization more at the back end of our curve.
One quick add there, we're also, legislature has also appropriated money for hard to decarbonize industries grants. So I know we were sharing with the governor some of the results of the program, and they invested in replacing boilers at an aluminum plant in the east part of our state. And that's a place where I think the combining of state and federal funding, because it's very expensive to decarbonize industry, it's a good sort of 1-2 to have a state source and then to try to leverage federal sources as well.
Thank you. Professor Hobbs?
Yeah, thanks. Ben Hobbs and Johns Hopkins. I'm going to follow up on Mike Powell's question. And it deals with the interaction of, you have a continental scale power market, which is becoming more important as you have more and more variable renewables, wind and solar. But at the same time, you have states with very different and somewhat incompatible carbon systems. So in the East, we have the regional greenhouse gas system, which all the that many states participate in, and is compatible with power trade across states. In the West, there's Washington and California, which have very different systems, and then Oregon is knocking on the door. And my, by the way, full disclosure, I used to work for Seattle City Light, and I'm now the chair of the Market Surveillance Committee for the California ISO. So the California Air Resources Board and the California ISO has been very concerned about what having the California system, Washington system, will make it much more difficult to trade power across boundaries. You may actually wind up penalizing some power sources twice for their carbon, or missing some others. And you see situations like last fall when California's carbon prices were half those in Washington for the same global pollutant. In retrospect, do you wish that there was a single reggie for the for the Western states? Should have Washington have approached things differently, or do you think you can overcome these issues so we can have efficient trade of renewable energy across the West, but also having states pursue their own policy goals?
Wow, I'd be happy to take that, Becky. That's a very complicated and nuanced question, so I appreciate that, Dr. Hobbs. I'll say, so it is complicated. We are a part of the Western power grid. We exchange a lot of power across state lines. We also don't have the advantage that the Cal ISO is one system operator that essentially is contiguous with the state's boundaries. Ours stretch across state boundaries, which make it more complicated. So this is a very complicated landscape, both figuratively and literally, in terms of thinking about electricity movement across state lines. So one of the reasons why our linking with the California market is so important is that one of the principles of Washington's program is that we don't double count emissions. And so we are very laser focused. There's a lot of market development, as you probably well know, and others may know, a lot of market development happening in the West right now. It's a very complicated scenario with multiple day-ahead markets being developed at the moment. We think that, I think in Washington, maybe something in the ballpark of 5% of power is exchanged in these sort of spot markets. My understanding is because of the dynamic, I'm not an electricity expert, I'll say, but I've done just enough of the work to be dangerous and talk about it, that they expect that, markets in the future, sort of spot markets and day ahead markets may may consume as much as 30 or 40% of power that's exchanged in the West. And so we are working actively with these market developers and a big piece of this is, greenhouse gas accounting across state lines. And so we're very focused on, as these, I guess, serendipitously, these markets are being created right now. So we have an opportunity to influence how that is tracked. We are very focused with work, and we work regularly on the weekly with California Air Resources Board staff, and also coordinate with CAISO staff on those markets being developed and making sure that the kinds of data, we use what's called a first jurisdictional deliverer kind of model. And so as power comes into the state, that's how we track it. And but that means you need to know where that power came from if you want to have a price signal associated with that electricity. And that's really significant to us to make sure that both that we're capturing, we don't have leakage, and that we're capturing all of the that for instance, green power isn't just being backfilled by carbon intense power, and also that we're not seeing other types of accounting where we're either double counting or not counting at all. And so that's a long-winded way of saying we are very much in progress in this area, and working very hard to, as these markets development, we are very in sync with our other regulators in Washington. We have our kind of responsibilities on this in Washington are distributed. So some sits in our Utilities and Transportation Commission, some of it sits in our Department of Commerce, and so we have a state team that's coordinating on how to interact with these markets as they're developing and make sure that we're tracking emissions in the most accurate way possible. And I don't think this is going to be a one and done. As the energy, power markets continue to evolve, we're going to have to continue to evolve with them to make sure that we're capturing emissions.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
And we're a couple minutes past the top of the hour. So Becky, Andy, thank you very much for continuing this conversation. We're on borrowed time, so I'm going to continue to take questions, and I'll leave it to you to tell me when you need to depart. Next is Mark from OPC.
Hey, thanks for taking the time to talk to us and answering our questions. I have two questions, and you may have already answered the first, but if so, I didn't catch the answer. Does the Washington program have either a cost containment reserve for when prices get higher than a certain level, or a reserve price? And have you had to invoke the cost containment reserve? And second question, I'm curious about what kind of economic analysis you did before the program kicked off. I assume there was some sort of macroeconomic analysis with REMI or Implant or something, but was there also any sort of distributional impact analysis? And if so, I'd be curious about what that said.
Andy, do you want to talk about the cost containment mechanisms?
Yeah, we have a variety of cost containment mechanisms. If you're familiar with California's, our program is largely similar. So we do have what we call it. Drawing a blank on we use the acronyms around here all the time, and I can't remember what the full. But we have a two-tiered we call a APCR, which is price containment reserve, and the AM for some reason I'm forgetting right now. In any case, thank you, allowance, okay, price containment reserve. So we have a two-tiered system, right? So at a certain price, the first tier kicks in. At the next price, another tier kicks in. We have we have a ceiling price as well, and we have provisions for providing ceiling price units in the event that that's reached. We have already triggered APCR. One of the interesting things, it's a very dynamic time to be starting a market in Washington. Not only do we have a new program, but a steep cap decline. And so there's a lot of, I think, as the market tries to, as I think is normal, and it's happening in California as well, as you're starting to establish a market, there's a lot of figuring out of strategies and et cetera. And then, the market's very, I think, subject to news and concerns and what happens in California. And there's this prospect of linkage with California and Quebec. These are all things that influence the market. And so it has been, we saw a pretty big increases in our allowance prices, triggering I think 2 APCR auctions. Then, when this initiative was declared, then we saw a drop in the price, pretty significant, like the price went half. So it's been a little volatile early on. But yes, we do have pretty significant price containment. One of the creating stability in any market is pretty significant to stabilizing prices and creating predictability for businesses. One of the reasons why we think linkage with California, Quebec could be really beneficial for Washington is their market's a lot larger than ours, about 6 times the size of Washington. So we and I believe other states that are considering markets in North America are also considering sort of like how ready would their program be to be linkage ready, right, into this larger market. So I think particularly for mid-sized and smaller states, that's a consideration that's worth, I think, contemplating. So we're working pretty hard on that right now and hope to address that, which I think would also have the effect of stabilizing our market.
Thanks. Garrett.
I'm sorry, could I had a second question, just like the economic analysis with I assume like macroeconomic, but was there any sort of like more fine-grained distributional analysis?
So we did, I'll just say briefly, we did do some modeling. We hired a company, they're now McKinsey. They previously were another company that I'm drawing a blank on before they were subsumed by McKinsey. They did some essentially market analysis of what they expected for prices. They looked at a number of scenarios for prices under both. Actually, we've done 2 rounds with them, right? So initial round was looking at what we expected to happen with prices, with our sort of price containment measures in place, et cetera. Another one looked at what happened. Some additional modeling looked at what happened if we merged with California. It's a proprietary model, which means it's not in itself very, I guess, transparent as far as how that works. But they consider a variety of, the pace of decarbonization in a variety of sectors. They have a number of assumptions that go into that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's online, so I can look into it. Thank you.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we have one of the reports is online. The initial work we did is online. And if you have trouble finding that, let me know and I can direct you to it.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, thanks so much, Becky and Andy, for answering our questions. So I have a comment and a question. My comment is I'm just very excited about this program and what we could do with the scale of investment in areas like equitable building and transportation decarbonization and grid enhancements and resilience and on down the line. It's not at all surprising to hear there's been some opposition to this in Washington. It seems to me very unlikely we would ever come up with a solution that would catalyze this scale of climate progress and or enable this scale of revenue that we could use for climate action that would make everyone happy. And that can't be the bar, or we will never get anywhere, right? And I feel like the method you all have come up with is very promising. It's great to hear that you're doing this now. We can learn from this in practice. My question is, I think Maryland we should take a hard look at this for sure here. My question, really following Mark's question about the analysis, you mentioned that gasoline, electricity, natural gas, all of this is covered by the program in addition to large individual emitters. I'm really curious about, I'm assuming that costs are effectively passed on to ratepayers or consumers of each of those things. And and I think Mark mentioned before you started speaking that ratepayer funded programs are the other major source of funding for a lot of climate programs in a lot of states right now. Of course, we're concerned about rates being a pretty regressive tool for getting revenue. And I'm just curious about whether you are doing something in the program design in Washington or have thought about something that could be done that maybe you're not doing yet to try to make the way the costs are passed on, like the revenue side of this. Appreciate all the equitable investment prioritization, but the way the revenue comes in, are you doing anything there to more equitably source the revenue, or are all these costs just kind of passed on in a relatively regressive way to to the users of all of those different types of energy sources?
Andy, you can probably speak to more of the details about the utility provisions, or maybe we can follow up. But fantastic question. Thank you for the comment and thank you for the question. And I'm looking in the chat, and Wandra Ashley Williams has posed a similar question about sort of the equitable aspects and the cost to consumers, particularly with regard to the utility pieces. The program is designed to give considerable free allowances, declining amounts, but considerable free allowances to utilities, and they can choose whether to go ahead and sell those on the market and then take the proceeds, or whether to just hand those free allowances back to the state and say, I'm covered, I'm not incurring any costs. But they are required to spend the proceeds of any allowances they sell, if that's the route they go, to benefit low and moderate income consumers. Some utilities have done that via on-bill rebates. Some are doing it via customer assistance with electrification or energy efficiency and so forth. And so I think it's a great point in the design of a program like this. You want to think about it on the front end as well as on the investment end. So how can you lower cost to consumers in terms of what to more vulnerable consumers, economically vulnerable consumers, in terms of what utilities might be putting on as costs. And we're having some very active conversations with our utility regulators, making sure that they understand how this program functions. Utilities, some investor-owned utilities, are coming in with very high estimates of what it might cost, and we're sort of having to educate our whole system and say, you know what, they're kind of highballing that. That's not actually how much it's going to cost. And so they're sort of trying to get the whole state ecosystem that's around consumer protection for utility customers kind of aligned and eagle-eyed on that point. Andy, would you add anything else?
Yeah, I think just to color that in a little bit, the electricity and natural gas are sort of dealt with differently in Washington, right? Electricity, we have the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which was passed before the Climate Commitment Act, is really designed to decarbonize the electricity sector in the long term. And those were already in place. By 2045, our electricity sector will be essentially carbon free, or maybe carbon neutral. So really the CCA sort of gets out of the way of the CETA, which and CETA, I'll say, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA, works directly on utilities to require them to essentially reduce their portfolio, the carbon intensity of their portfolio over time. Essentially, the CCA gets out of the way, says CETA is driving that decline, and we provide low cost, no cost allowances to electricity utilities that then go to reduce the cost at the consumer level of electricity to customers. And as Becky pointed out, if they consign those back for auction, then those have to be prioritized for low income customers first, and programs need to be developed there. So natural gas side works a little bit differently. There's natural gas, we envision a long-term natural gas essentially is going to get phased out, right? Along with all other fossil fuels over time in order to reach our goals by 2050. And so essentially we give them no cost allowances, but they march down at the pace of the cap over time. So it's to defray the costs. They have to consign their allowances to the market, which means they get sold on the market and the revenue comes back to the utility, and that money then has to be provided out to customers. It's mandated, and that's managed somewhat by the sort of the regulators, the utility regulators, and with an emphasis on low income customers. So it is meant to defray. In fact, I think the lowest income customers don't actually see zero additional cost from natural gas increases. So we are still learning. Utilities are still learning about how to do this. We're still learning about how to communicate well with the utilities as well, and we're working with our utility regulators to do that. But over time, this should buffer the cost to make it a more reasonable, I think, glide path for customers. But the cost of their power for the average customer will go up. I mean, that's the reality if it's a carbon intensive power source.
Thank you. I'll go to Kathy Magruder.
Hi, I'm just curious, does Washington State have a green bank type entity? And if you don't, are you considering doing that, or how do you look to leverage the investment?
Thanks, Kathy. We have just set up a green bank. Because of various constitutional issues for a long time, we thought state constitution, we thought we might not be able to, but we found that we could, and have set up a new nonprofit green bank through our State Department of Commerce. And that's just been funded for staffing, and we're just getting going. But we want to make sure and leverage the federal funds that can go to green banks. I will say we're not anticipating necessarily using, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say that, it's early. I don't know that that'll be a central piece of spending this money. But I will say, the point of having a mechanism that can leverage more finance than we would have otherwise is definitely something we're looking at through the green bank. And probably over time, the revenues from this program will be, some of them will be deployed in similar ways. How can we kind of create an engine of finance?
Do you have a particular investment in standing it up right now?
Yes, our legislature appropriated funding for that. And I believe it was Climate Commitment Act revenues, in fact.
Do you know how much? Could you share how much?
It's about, let me double check and get back to you. I don't want to say the wrong number. It's not a huge number, but it's enough to hire staff. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks. Kim Coble, and then after Kim, we might do a last call for questions from MWG members before letting our guests depart and set off to whatever else Becky and Andy have going on today.
Thanks, Mark. And listen, on behalf of the whole mitigation work group, I want to thank Andy and Becky for really taking a lot of generous amount of time and sharing your knowledge. I actually have two questions because I'm sold, right? Like, I love it. I think it brings in tons of revenue, which we need. And I think, basing it on pollution is a really strong selling point. So my questions are dealing with the administration of it. And I guess this might be directed at Andy. What size program do you have? How many people? What's your annual budget? Like, what's it take to manage this using state resources? That's one question. The second question, and Becky, this is probably for you, but, if you were in Maryland, and if we were going to move ahead with this, what advice would you give us for the next year or 2 years as some program gets established and set up?
Well, I can answer the first part. I'll say Washington the legislature has been very good, and the governor in particular, this is really one of his marquee priorities has been the passing of a climate program here in Washington. So been very supportive of staffing on this, and it does take pretty significant resources. I mean, we have right now, I don't know the exact number of FTEs we have, but we probably have right now 30 or 35 staff that are hired. We may have authority to hire another 15 or so. So, directly working on in terms of directly working on the Cap and Invest program, maybe sort of 50 at this time, in the ballpark, 50, 60, something like that, maybe a little bit less than 60. And then we also have, folks that are working on the overburden community side and doing this, sort of air quality monitoring, et cetera, which is additional investments. And then the state is making investments in other agencies, right, also to do work to allow them to participate and engage. I will say one of the biggest issues has been, obviously, ramp up is hard, right? I'll just say it's hard, right? Because number one, there's not like a ton of people floating around out there with this expertise, right? And so there's like California and a few other markets. There's some folks who work in voluntary markets, and and some, I'm sure, folks who work for for Reggie, et cetera. But there's not a big market of people who have expertise here, so you have to build expertise as you go, which can be challenging. And then in addition, we've been working in an extremely good job market, which is great for people looking for jobs and not great for us. And so it's been really hard to find people who are qualified, even people who are qualified to learn this material, let alone people who have this sort of expertise. So ramp up can be challenging, but we're and it's the first few years of building a program, as you can imagine, are stressful and hard, but we have a really fantastic group of people who are here because they really care about this work, and that's what's powering them through to work long hours and do incredibly hard work up front.
Thank you, Andy.
Becky, do you want to chime in on your advice to a state that is contemplating this sort of policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I would say, and we're doing it right now, is really leverage the expertise of those who have gone before. We started talking to California, and actually Environmental Defense Fund was pretty involved in our legislative debate over this law. Folks from California were on calls with legislative leaders on the weekends, walking through elements. There is a big brain trust, and I would say really leverage it. The reason we're so happy to spend time with you here today is none of this works unless we, to Michael's earlier question, unless we get more people on board. It doesn't work from a climate perspective, obviously, to have a few states doing this. We've got to reduce emissions globally, but it also doesn't really work politically in the long run until there's sort of a pretty big group doing it. And it helps address leakage issues. The more people who are both limiting and pricing this pollution and investing in rapid decarbonization, the better the whole system works. So leverage people, and don't think it's more of a favor. It's kind of a collective effort for sure. I would say having some leadership is important. We obviously had the governor. We also had key legislators who've kind of been with us on the journey. So educating some folks and partnering with some folks who are going to be there for the whole roller coaster ride is, politics 101, that. But I think some of it is just kind of getting those folks up to speed. And then over time, I talked about our long, complicated history. We had ballot measures and fights and different things, but over time, we did develop a very broad spectrum of stakeholders who were on board. British Petroleum is a supporter. I'm only sharing information, but they are a big part of the campaign against repeal this fall. So is the labor unions and the labor community. So are the tribes. The environmental justice questions have been complicated for good reason. We've talked a little bit about that, but that is we've baked in equity into the policy and the investments in a way that has really brought environmental justice communities to the table to be part of the decision-making team, both on the investment side and the policy side. Not entirely. I don't want to soft sell that. That's a complicated area. So I would say, build the team, learn from others. We can definitely help you anticipate where you're going to be hit if you decide to go down this route. And then, I know New York and Governor Hochul's team are really they're really honing in on how do you bring consumers along? How do you protect consumers? Because that does end up being a big part of kind of the political and public conversation. So the other thing I'd emphasize is there are really a lot of design choices that you get to make as a state. It is a basic structure. There's a whole lot you can do in how you design the program, both on the regulation side of the allowances and the emissions and all of that, and also on the investment side. So you could design a pretty lousy cap and invest program, or you can design a really good one. and then know that you'll always probably be improving it over time.
Well, that is a great segue to something I was going to offer to everyone, which is that there's an organization called Resources for the Future, or RFF, that's been supporting the development of cap and invest programs in other states. One option the MWG here has, if you want to learn more about what are some of those program design elements, what are the big design considerations that Maryland would have to work through, the kind of policy decisions and design decisions. We can invite RFF to our next meeting if you'd like, so that we could start to unpack, what are cost containment reserves and everything else that came up today, and some topics that didn't. So I'll just put that out on the table, perhaps for consideration for the MWG steering committee. But with that, we've benefited greatly from a tremendous amount of time that Becky and Andy have given us. We should probably let them go and turn to a couple of other items of business for the MWG. Thank you very much. Say hi to Governor Inslee from us. Tell UW that they probably got it right in not admitting me a long time ago. and thanks. Thanks and thanks in advance for being a resource to us if we have any follow-up questions.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Becky, you're muted.
I said, sorry, thanks for all the hard work and for your great questions. We wish you well, and we are definitely a resource. And yeah, thanks for finding ways to push forward in the ways that make sense for Maryland. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have actually just, other than public comments, one other part of the agenda, which was a touch base on the MWG's work plan, which was really I was trying to blend that into the wrap up on the Cap and Invest section to point out the MWG and the Climate Commission writ large has pointed out for a while now that we need to do a deeper dive in funding mechanisms and have more conversation about the mechanisms that were floated in the climate plan. It's an open question for Maryland. What's the right approach for our state? Again, we can offer to have more conversation about cap and invest. We can offer to have conversation about some of the other mechanisms that were floated in the climate plan, or other funding mechanisms that we haven't discussed yet. So wanted to open up some space, and I'll also, of course, invite our co-chairs to facilitate this part as well. What we're looking for input at this point, as Mike pointed out in his opening remarks, we don't want to wind up in September and then have a bunch of new ideas presented when that's pretty late in our calendar year for coming up with recommendations for this year. So wanted to create a little bit of space to identify topics that the MWG would want to discuss. Again, funding mechanisms are very much on our list. The other things on the list, just so you know, members have identified wanting to think about recommendations for reducing vehicle miles traveled. The VMT conversation that we've started having this year. Garrett mentioned clean energy legislation, the governor's 100% goal. Is there space for the MWG to discuss that this year? Solar siting and permitting continues to be a perennial topic, a challenge for Maryland. Is there an area within that where the MWG can have some meaningful contributions? So on and so forth. So those are some of the topics, but wanted to create a little bit of space to hear about other issues that you'd want to discuss, or any next steps on that cap and invest conversation that you want to have.
I think Garrett's raised his hand.
Thanks, Mike. I love all four of those things. I know sometimes we prefer to not try to have a list of 20 things to talk about, and I appreciate that. But all four of those sound really important. Just on the funding streams, this piece around both how we get to enough revenue to be useful and do that in an equitable manner, I think are both really important angles to that conversation. And I just hope that we'll bring both of those in. I'm fine with just talking cap and invest, but I think it'd be useful to talk about more than just cap and invest, because we need to be kind of pulling on a few different threads, and hopefully one of them's going to turn into something. Just two more that I would love to add to the list personally. I would love to see us talk more about workforce development, especially related to who's going to do all of this HVAC and solar related work, and how do we get there. There was a little conversation about that in the PSC space earlier, or within the last handful of months, that then I feel like kind of fizzled out, and it wasn't sort of their space to talk about. But I think we need more of a coordinated plan on that. And the other one is data centers and the impact that data centers may well end up having on the grid and our ability to do all these different things that we're talking about. I'm increasingly terrified of the potential impacts of data centers, and I think there needs to be a plan, and I think this is the right group to have at least some orienting conversation, so that we're all able to be part of thinking about what the future of data centers in Maryland, any policy approaches there should look like.
That may segue into Kathy put a comment on grid reliability before we come back to Mark. Kathy, do you want to expand on what your comment in the chat?
Thanks, Mike. I think that was Garrett hit on one of the topics that I think is relevant to that discussion. But I think we also need to look at transmission and distributed resources and real-time demand response, and all of the pieces of the puzzle that don't necessarily fit within one of the easy categories, but are all part of the big picture. The more we can fold that into the discussion with regard to greenhouse gas reduction, I think the better off we'll be.
Just a related programming note this week. 3 of the new Climate Commission working groups are launching, including the Energy Resilience and Efficiency Working Group. I'm putting a link to that in the chat right now. So a lot of these reliability resilience issues will be handled there, which isn't to say that there isn't space at the MWG to discuss them. But with 8 working groups, we are now covering a lot of topics. And by the way, just for the fun of it, running on average 2 working group meetings every week of the year. You can tune in and get your fill of Climate Commission conversation. So there's a whole lot happening. But anyhow, it's a note that there are some topics that you all might raise that are actually now the jurisdiction of another working group.
Mark, just one question on that. Yeah, I apologize, but it occurred to me. Some of us are raising real concerns about impacts on pricing of electricity. Will that group be looking at that, or between the Brandon Shores, the new transmission line, and the new substations, there's an awful lot of price pressure going to come to bear right at the time we electrify. Who's looking at that? Where does that fall within the criteria or work groups?
It's not explicitly a topic, but it's kind of inherently part of the conversation for that other working group. I don't mean to suggest that a topic cannot be discussed by the MWG, just acknowledging that some of these topics we might need to coordinate on the agendas between different working groups.
I think Mark has had his hand up and I'm delaying him.
Thanks, Mike. In answer to that last question about who's looking at the intersecting price impacts, I think OPC certainly is, the PSC obviously as well, and in a number of different contexts. At the PSC, there are, I don't know how many working groups that cover various of these issues in some ways. I know Garrett participates in some. And I wonder if at some point it might be useful for this group to sort of get a comprehensive take on exactly what's going on in that context, to sort of understand what is happening at the PSC. But the comment I was going to make is I don't have any additional bullets. I like Garrett's additions, Kathy's addition. I think the workforce development issue is especially worth picking up. But I also just wanted to second Mark. I don't know if you were making a motion for RFF to come to the next call, but I fully support that. to sort of dive a little bit deeper into some of the design elements around a cap and invest. And it sounds as though you might be able to make that happen. So I think that would be a great agenda for a call.
I think Ian's the next up.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with Mark, and I see Christina has her hand up from the PSC, so I think it'll be a good segue that a lot of these electricity, transmission, grid reliability, a lot of these are very complicated, tricky issues that other bodies are looking at. And I think I would hesitate for this body, which I think is more general, you know, we focus on general economy-wide, right? How is the state going to meet its climate commitments, right? I mean, it's a very general purview. And I think there's a lot of groups out there, including some of the other working groups that Mark Stewart mentioned, as well as other agencies like the PSC working groups and others that are more technically inclined and more focused in on certain issues. And so I think I would suggest that it might be worth it, you know, if somebody from the PSC maybe can give us an overview, and Mark, maybe you can help from OPC, you know, in terms of what's happening there, what's happening on transmission. At MEA, I'm be happy to assist with that. But before we start diving in on subjects that, you know, are already being, you know, looked at, if there's an area that's not being looked at, maybe we should surface that. But I think otherwise, I think this group is better served by taking a little bit of a broader look, like we have in the past, whether it's building decarb or transportation or, you know, more sector kind of conversations, not at all questioning that electricity and pricing is important.
I think Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina from the PSC. I'm relatively new here, so I don't know the full breadth of all the things that our working groups are looking at, but we do have no shortage of them. And like Ian said, you know, they're looking at high-level technical components to these issues. So I'm happy to kind of ask around here to see if somebody could provide an overview and answer questions, you know, for this group.
I think that would be useful. I think Ian is right that it's not our primary responsibility. I think my concern is making sure we understand any implications and that come out of any recommendations we do make. And to the extent you can brief us on from the PSC, which, you know, reminder, of course, Fred is joining the commission this year. So that would be very useful for us as a work group. No more hands. This is not quite a speak now or forever hold your peace, but if you don't put items on the agenda, it is very possible we'll simply say we can't get to them this year. So if there's something on your mind, please let us know. Okay. Mark?
Yeah, and we'll welcome any, feel free, of course, anytime to email me if other topics come to your mind, and I'll be happy to share those with the steering committee. That brings us to public comments. We have a lot of folks who've joined us today. It's excellent. And happy to hear your contributions. Kathy.
Thank you, Mark. I just wanted to mention to the members that the Maryland Clean Energy Summit is scheduled to take place on Monday, October 7th and 8th at the College Park Marriott. And as part of that conference on day one, we're going to be hosting a series of policy and planning roundtables, 2-hour discussions, and diving into a number of the topics that we've heard today. We're going to have a table on achieving solar standards, one on clean transportation, one on equity and access for consumers, one on grid reliability, one on building energy performance, and then one on funding and financing decarbonization. We will be inviting thought leaders, subject matter experts, policymakers, agency personnel. Mark has agreed to chair the building or to moderate the building energy performance roundtable. So if there's anyone on the work group that has a burning desire to participate in the discussion or is interested in suggesting someone who should be at the table, I welcome your input. And We're planning now. We're, of course, looking for sponsors, but I want to make sure that these tables are staffed well. The second piece of the agenda will be for the moderator to bring to the conference the next day at the opening plenary recommendations, suggestions, and action items that come out of the discussion for future uptake by different parties. So I think it's a great talking to each other instead of talking at the audience opportunity for this conference, and we welcome your involvement. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Kathy. And I think we got a request from Ava to share a link to that event. So if you could put that in the chat, that'd be really great. Any other comments from anyone? Jeff Silva, go ahead, please.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much. Basically, for this meeting, it was focused on revenue for our mitigation projects. You folks have the great position, an opportunity to be able to signal to make economic signals to the state economy by placing the fee structure on the sources of pollution. Now, you backed away from putting a additional registration fee and from even recommending that on large personal use heavy vehicles, say ones that weigh over 2.5 tons, perhaps. So really, you've got to come back to this. Now, this meeting was for examining funding sources, and the folks at Washington State, yes, they're farther along. Fortunately, they had a governor who probably during the term of our last Republican governor, the Washington State governor was very motivated in trying to solve the climate change problem, and our time is dwindling. So they even admitted that they have to catch up, and so they're accelerating their reduction of greenhouse gases in the first years of their program. They've got the advantage of what? Hydropower? We don't have that advantage. So we're going to have to make market force adjustments. And I don't see, and when those market force adjustments are suggested, it doesn't make it past your committee. At least you have to make the effort. Please make recommendations at trying to put the market forces to aid the reduction of greenhouse gases and also pay for the necessary projects, such as possibly relocating people out of harm's way of rising sea levels or forest fires or so on. It's coming. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And just a note for everyone, the General Assembly passed legislation this year that would increase vehicle registration fees with higher fees on heavier vehicles. So just for everyone's benefit, I put a link to a recent article on that in the chat. Are there any other comments for today's meeting? Seeing none, Mike or Kim, would you like to make any closing comments?
I don't think any here other than, again, thanking everyone for participating.
Yeah, I too want to thank everybody. I think it's been a good meeting, and thank you, Mark, for coordinating it.
My pleasure and duty. All right, everyone. Take care. See you next month.
Thanks all.